Koblenz, end of 1918. These good-humored soldiers standing at the German corner are American officers. The German Kaiserreich was defeated and their weapons silent. It was the American forces that had won the decisive victories along the Western Front. During the following years, the Americans would hold the Watch on the Rhine. Today, Johannes Heibel is waiting in expectation of flight DL-14 from Atlanta, which has just landed. On board, an American family member who he didn't know existed until shortly.
I'm waiting for my second cousin, David Harstin, whom I've never met. We've only had email contact since recently. Now my temperature is rising. It is going to be a special moment.
The moment of a family reunion after almost 100 years had arrived. Their common relatives have been part of the American occupation stationed in the Westerwald in 1919. Kai-Michael Sprenger, a historian in Mainz, has been researching the American occupation period after World War I.
As a historian, I have researched the presence of Americans since World War II, when I realized the previous occupation between 1918 and 1923 is barely mentioned in German literature. I stumbled across the fact talking to colleagues who didn't know about that fact either. The presence of the Americans, especially since World War II in Rhine-Pfalz, is an important topic, but their presence after World War I has yet to become popular.
David Harstin, a preacher from Tennessee, had never met his grandfather. Now he's discovering how the First World War had influenced his family. News of the ceasefire taking effect at 11 o'clock, November 11th, 1918 spread quickly. In only a few minutes, the weapons were silent. The Americans and the French celebrated together, burying the last German grenade, a dud. While the Germans and the French were now standing across from each other along the armistice line without firing a shot. The joy was boundless. The crowds partied in the streets. German military was received in Berlin with much fanfare, while other units dissolved or disbanded and, marching with red flags, plundered along the way. Workers' and soldiers' councils began revolting. The armistice established the entire area left of the Rhine to be occupied by Allied troops beginning December 1st, 1918. It secured the bridgeheads across the Rhine in Cologne, Koblenz, and Mainz, while establishing a neutral demilitarized zone. The American occupation zone stretched along the Moselle River between Trier and Koblenz, along the southern Hunsrück and the eastern Eifel. On the right side of the Rhine, the zone continued between Westerwald to the Lahn River. Later, the American zone was downsized. For the entire period, the headquarters for the 250,000 men of the U.S. Third Army, simply known as the Army of Occupation, was in Koblenz. Americans marched into an unknown country, first reaching Trier. It was one of the first contacts between Americans and the German population. The inhabitants lined the streets, silent but curious, as a newsman reported. The Prussian police provided a welcome. Some of the troops followed the Moselle River. While others marched through the Hunsrück on their way to Simmern and Kirchberg. At Bacharach, they reached the Rhine River. Their goal was Koblenz. General of the Army, John J. Pershing, commanded the American Expeditionary Forces with experience he gained fighting during the Indian Wars, in Cuba and the Philippines. Early on, he gave a non-fraternization order which prohibited contact or relationships to Germans. But reality was something very different.
One has to envision some 250,000 men housed in tight quarters, a huge number of men when compared to the approximately 1 million inhabitants of the area. Public buildings were used as quarters, but they were not enough, so that private homes were soon requisitioned. This was in direct conflict with the non-fraternization order and naturally resulted in soldiers having contacts with the local population.
Men of both sides were standing across from each other, who had a short time earlier been killing each other. Private Edward Inman was housed in such quarters, of a family whose son had just returned from the war. He wrote in his diary,
"We ate supper with them, discussed the war as best we could, without any feelings of hate, at least on our part. They are just as glad the war was over as we were."
In the small village of Bamberscheid, Johannes Heibel was shown a house that had belonged to his grandfather. In their family history, there was a hole. No one knew that their grandfather was an American soldier.
Gerti, renoviert, restauriert, das ist natürlich alles neu gemacht worden. Eigentlich hat mein Vater das ja lang, das Familiengeheimnis gehütet.
My father had kept this a secret from us, which he never talked about until 2001. I had heard something prior, but my father was reserved and I never really took the time to ask more. He had come back to Bamberscheid in 1943 while fighting along the Russian front to marry my mother. Until then, he had not known that he was actually a child of an American occupation soldier of World War I. He had considered his stepfather as being his real father. He recalled as a child being hassled by the son of the local mayor who yelled at him, USA. At the time, my father didn't know its actual background.
Konnte natürlich überhaupt nichts damit anfangen, weil die Geschichte ja nicht kannte.
In 2001, he showed his son this photo of a man kneeling, and he stated, "This is your grandfather, an American occupation soldier." On the right side of the Rhine River, the American occupation soldiers were on maneuvers, and many of them placed in private quarters. After the long, enjoyable dances in the villages, many of the young women found themselves pregnant. Heibel's grandmother being no exception.
Just imagine, shortly after World War I, a 16-year-old girl became pregnant. Unthinkable back then. A very difficult situation for a village family who had no means or even the courage to search for an American long gone.
A temporary field kitchen was set up in the stables. Heibel discovered that such a field kitchen was located right next door to their house. The Warren photo of 1919 showed such a situation, although the man kneeling is not really recognizable, but this photo had been taken in the yard of their home.
When I was a soldier,
Heibel can't let loose. His research in the United States failed. But the American historian Alexander Barnes was able to help. An online genealogical data bank was the breakthrough. Johannes Heibel had taken a DNA test, which resulted in success. A man by the name of David Harston from Tennessee had also taken this test, although he never could have dreamed that he had relatives in Germany.
pigeons. When Johannes contacted me through our DNA, with Ancestry.com, it didn't really surprise me because, these things happen. But it really got me busy to learning more about my grandfather and his brothers. And immediately I wanted to find out if we shared a grandfather.
David's grandfather was Lester Denton. He and his brother Paul served in the 1st U.S. Division and were stationed in the Westerwald. Further DNA tests proved that Paul Denton was the actual grandfather of Johannes Heibel.
Just by the fact that Johannes and I discovered each other, I'm learning. It makes me want to learn more about my heritage, because ultimately we're all one family. We're all brothers and sisters.
For the historian Kai Sprenger, research on this taboo subject is just beginning.
I am sure that this was not a single incident, and by researching genealogical sources, similar family stories and relationships will come to light. This is a part of the German-American history, which is only slowly being explored and becoming a reality which is very fascinating.
The State Archives in Koblenz contains a treasure of diaries written by Stefan Weidenbach, an archivist from Andernach. A local historian, Gunther Hafke, knows these sources well. Weidenbach tells without prejudice about the years of American occupation in Andernach, his first impressions of the Americans.
In general, I noted how Americans treated their soldiers and vice versa, a friendly relationship, although a strong discipline can be noted. The American soldiers were not as good at marching compared to the Germans, but they rode their horses much more comfortably, demonstrating outstanding horsemanship, but less elegant. Their uniforms were proper, a short coat in coffee brown with an unusual hat form. Every soldier had a pistol. The population of Andernach remained calm, amazed by the strangers. But the youth, they were everywhere, friendly towards the Americans, climbing on their vehicles, helpful. And naturally, the soldiers joked and played with them.
The people of Andernach were shocked when they heard that these soldiers were going to be put up in their homes. But these fears were unfounded. According to Weidenbach, many soldiers were taken in as members of the family or shown the local pubs. This harmony was not always the rule, but more common than we think. A Catholic family related to the Hohenzollern royalty lives in the Normandy castle near Andernach. Heide, the Hohenzollern princess, knows the family story of her father-in-law. During World War I, the large glass hall had been used as a lazaret. Josephine von Hohenzollern, the sister to the Belgian king, along with their daughters, ran the hospital, while her husband, Prince Karl, fought along the front. By the end of 1918, the American forces were quartered here. The Princess of Hohenzollern shows the historian Kai Sprenger the traces of the American presence. One can envision what this must have been like from the painting in the hall, marked by bayonet cuts in the artwork.
As the Americans arrived, it came as a shock, since on our walls many of the paintings depicted our German military ancestors. The Hohenzollern always had been an officer's family, serving their nation, who happened to have been the enemy. The name Hohenzollern was a disliked anyway. Downstairs, the Americans shot a hole through the painting of my grandmother. There was hate after the war.
In Josephine's diary, it states that it was unheard of that they stay under the same roof with Americans.
Christmas, December 1918. The holidays were dreary, since the house was full of Americans. They were courteous enough, but still we had to tolerate the uneasy situation.
She and her husband had a wonderful marriage. But one experience left its mark on their family.
The most terrible part of this, her husband, Prince Karl, had returned from the war, a frightening experience with pneumonia, which meant back then almost certain death. While lying in bed, ill, the Americans played jazz and made noise. While he was dying, the army held a ball in this room. During the funeral procession, procession to the church, the Americans sat along the wall and spit upon his coffin. My father-in-law never forgot this, and under no circumstances would travel to the United States.
This story had a sequel, since Josephine was related to the Belgian royal family, who happened to be allies of the Americans. The Spanish flu crossed the ocean with American troop transports to Europe. The flu caused the deaths of some 62,000 American soldiers, while more than 50 million perished from the disease worldwide. The Chronicles of Weidenbach reported,
because of the flu, the American soldiers had received the vaccine, but not before many doughboys had died in Mayen.
On December 13, 1918, the American Army of Occupation gathered in Koblenz. With long columns of soldiers and equipment, they crossed the Rhine and established themselves in the Ehrenbreitstein fortress and secured the river crossings. In the Westerwald, the occupation zone was marked by large signs, behind which lay the neutral zone. To enter the occupation zone, passage papers were required. The old bridge, just like the old section of Koblenz, have long disappeared. There are only a few remaining structures that recall the occupation after World War I. Mark Holzheimer, a historian and guide in Koblenz, knows each and every location that still exists from this period and tells visitors the stories of the occupation.
Hier stehen wir direkt vor dem alten preußischen Regierungsgebäude.
Here stands the old Prussian administration building, built in the early 20th century for the royal government. During the occupation, the Americans established their headquarters and main administration in this building. Directly situated next door was the Hotel Koblenzer Hof, which was used as officers' quarters. Located along the Rhine River, a wonderful view of the Ehrenbreitstein fortress. From his rooms, General Allen could see each day the fortress, as he wrote in his diary, on which the American flag waved, a special symbol of American occupation and the watch on the Rhine.
Major General Henry T. Allen had been placed in charge of the occupation forces in July 1919. He was the right man for the right job, able to enforce policies, and was well educated. He knew Germany perfectly, having once served as a military attaché in Berlin, and he was in part responsible for the fact that the Ehrenbreitstein fortress was not destroyed by the French. The terms of the Treaty of Versailles stated that all fortifications along the Rhine were to be destroyed. In his diary, General Allen recalls talking to the French commanding general, Marshal Foch, convincing him to spare the fortress because of its historical significance.
Man weiß, dass einige Deutsche Beamte, auch Offiziere.
One knows that certain German officials and former officers attempted to influence the situation with only minimal success. General Allen was not authorized to make decisions, but he was an important figure in the Rhineland. It was a combination of various influencing factors that prevented the fortress from being destroyed.
The fortress is today the seat of the Institute for Cultural Heritage in Rhineland-Pfalz. An original American flag is part of its collection, and it is an object of pride for Mr. Thomas Metz, the general director.
The flag once belonged to Daniel Osborne, who arrived from France with the other soldiers. He originally nailed it on a gate of the Ehrenbreitstein fortress. The nail holes can be seen to this day. The flag remained on the fortress until 1923, as long as American soldiers were stationed here. Afterwards, the flag found its way back to Koblenz and now belongs to the cultural heritage, which lives through the stories of such pieces.
The majority of the American occupation force, some 17,000 men, were stationed in Koblenz. The Americans had confiscated the Fest Hall, where the women volunteers from the YMCA, had a library, snack bar, and organized concerts and dances for the soldiers. Princess Sananya Redfeather, a Cherokee Indian, a well-known entertainer, was a guest at the YMCA. Daily trips on the confiscated ships provided the American soldiers regular tours of the Rhine River. Sightseeing and dances prevented boredom. The doughboys had heard about the castles, the myths, and the legends of the Rhine. Now they learned more. In the Central State Archive, one finds travel guides produced in English extra for these doughboys.
Und diese touristische, kulturelle Annäherung an die Region, die spielt eine große Rolle.
The various YMCA cultural tourist events for the doughboys were an important pastime factor, as exemplified in this booklet, which described the local activities in Andernach. Listed are the tours, locations and restaurants in Andernach that soldiers could visit. It was extremely important to show the doughboys the German culture and countryside. Perhaps this interest arose from the fact that many US soldiers had family ties or relatives living in Germany. I tend to believe that it was part of official policy and not just a note on the side, that the American soldiers be shown the surrounding culture.
Das war nicht nur eine Randnotiz, sondern war ein echtes Programm.
These tours offered a welcome change for the daily drill experienced by the soldiers, but these men were still frustrated. Edward Inman, stationed in Kripp, wrote in his diary,
The sights we want to see is the Statue of Liberty. If we ever get there back once, you won't get this bird out of the United States again. Wouldn't take this whole country as a gift. Nor France either. Try as we cannot interest ourselves in anything here. These beautiful scenes, historical sites, or old legendary wonders are all passed by with a scant look. It is nothing compared with the sight of hardship, the agonies, the magnitude of devastation, the horrors, and the deaths of war that we've all experienced. Home is ahead of us. That's what we want. Get all this other stuff out of the way.
The occupation soldiers of World War I called themselves doughboys, the name for infantry soldiers, just like the term GI is used for World War II soldiers.
Der Begriff taucht erstmals gegen Mitte des 19. Jahrhunderts.
The term doughboy sprang up in the mid-19th century, although its meaning remains uncertain. Apparently, American soldiers fighting in the Spanish-American War had a thick layer of dust on their uniforms from the dry, dusty areas of northern Mexico. It gave the appearance of flour on a dough, creating the term doughboy.
Es gibt andere Erklärungsmuster, aber das ist die gängigste.
The Germans noticed that the doughboys were always clean-shaven, while German soldiers tended to have mustaches. And the Americans were always chewing on something, which most found curious. In 1919, the United States government began enforcing prohibition back stateside. The doughboys, being typical young men, had little experience with alcohol, but along the Rhine and Moselle rivers, alcohol was commonplace, especially wine, which they were allowed to consume, while whiskey, cognacs, etc. were strictly forbidden. Bars that sold American soldiers hard beverages were heavily fined. Although controlled, the well-off doughboys could afford any prices, even if illegal. On payday, the local population was best kept at home. Mr. Weidenbach recalls in Andernach,
as the mailman Mr. Wagner, upon returning from work, was beaten unconscious by 6 American soldiers. Such stories occurred often, especially after a few drinks. Upon going to the police, he was asked for the names of the men who had done this. Naturally, he could not provide them, so that nothing could be done.
A short time later, Mr. Weidenbach himself was beaten, totally without reason. The frustration of these men exploded, and conflict could begin with no reason at all.
Whenever young women were involved, together with German men, was often reason enough to start a fight, whether defending the honor, their girlfriend, or for no reason at all. Weidenbach saw both sides responsible for the tempers.
So Veranstaltungen, was the YMCA and the Knights of Columbus on Jewish welfare and Catholic welfare.
Kai Sprenger visited his American colleague, who is knowledgeable about the American presence in Germany. John Provan is a PhD historian who lives in Kelkheim, Germany. He has one of the largest private collections of material on the U.S. occupations of both World Wars and the Cold War.
My father was in the U.S. Air Force and was stationed in Germany 3 times, Sembach, Kaiserslautern, and Rhine-Main. I've only lived in the United States for 4 years, and naturally met a German Fräulein, and have remained here ever since. As a historian, I quickly noted that the entire occupation periods are poorly documented, so that it's sort of my calling to save as many army records and as much material as possible for future generations.
There are many similarities to both occupation periods.
The first occupation was very short, lasting only 4 years, during which time we see everything repeated that happened during the Cold War. There were sporting events. We had our own bakeries, because the Germans never made donuts or pumpkin pies. We see American soldiers giving candy to German children. But here, it is a doughboy. Such images and events are embedded in our collective memories of World War II, of GIs giving chewing gum or Hershey's. This all had already occurred years prior, after World War I. I find the mirror of history repeating itself fascinating.
His basement contains only a small portion of his collection from American occupations of Germany. The rest is found in various storage areas and a bunker. He obtained his collection through eBay or fishing it out of trash cans on the numerous U.S. installations that have closed over the past 25 years. Entire libraries and archives. Original posters from the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association. They played an important role providing for the doughboys.
Wo findest du so etwas?
Mein Vater ist genauso ein Sammler wie ich und er hat auch eine Ahnung, was ich so suche. Und so ab und zu mal kommt so.
And there was the YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Association, which organized entertainment activities for the American men.
Und muss man ganz vorsichtig sein.
Something that he found at a flea market in the United States. A rare panorama photo taken of the maneuver grounds near the Maria Lach Monastery. And something which exists during any occupation period, prostitution.
The need was great, and with approximately 17,000 doughboys in Koblenz, there was a market for certain services. Many young ladies came to Koblenz, according to passport records, indicating their professions while registering themselves to local authorities. Although strictly controlled, there was usually no means of proving the statements provided. One often discovers a notation, poor reputation, since the young lady had been caught in a bar or with Americans in a car, or even worse, with a soldier in bed.
Oder weil tatsächlich mit Amerikaner im Bett.
Many young ladies saw these easygoing, well-off doughboys as a means out of a desperate situation. Men of their age had been killed, mutilated, or psychologically ruined from the war.
Come on, gang, let's call it.
The non-fraternization order was revoked in 1919. The YMCA provided social behavior and etiquette classes to the young men. In Koblenz, some 1,200 marriages were performed between Fräuleins and the doughboys. In the marriage records of the city, their names can be found, including many Henrys and Williams among the birth records. One also discovers some 1,800 illegitimate children born during this time, although in reality these figures are probably much higher. The same story repeats itself for Andernach and numerous other villages.
Und hier sind über 100 Eheschließungen verzeichnet. More than 100 marriages are documented. Amongst them, Heinrich Bukowski, who married Katharina Fett in 1920. Their son would become the famous American author Charles Bukowski.
In the Maine State Archive in Koblenz, Frank Neupert works as an archivist, maintaining the photo collection of his hometown, Pleit. The painter, Peter Mannebach, had permission to take photos of doughboys standing in front of a painted background. These were popular gifts sent back home. Some of these images show doughboys with their girlfriends, who many went on to marry and take their brides to the United States. They became part of many family histories. Race discrimination was still common within the U.S. Army, while soldiers from the Philippines were not considered as blacks. It was probably with this very individual that Frank Neupert's aunt had a child.
Gregor was born in 1921, while my aunt was only 14 years old. One can just imagine the scandal arose in a village in the conservative Catholic region.
Since she was underage, the doughboy father could not marry and take her to the States. Gregor was then later adopted by his stepfather.
Later came the Nazi race discrimination laws, in which my cousin really didn't fit. Purists at heart failed to figure out the situation, so that they simply labeled him a Rhineland bastard. The dark-skinned men had to be sterilized to keep German race pure.
Under considerable pressure by the Nazis, the disheartened mother permitted the sterilization. The alternative for both would have been the concentration camp. Gregor Bertz was a good athlete and integrated into the local community. During World War II, he served in the German Navy, which was good enough for the Nazis. He was also a good soccer player that later trained a member of the 1964 Olympic team who won the gold medal. Gregor Bertz died in 2003. The village of Sinzig is in the northern part of the U.S. zone. In December 1918, the Villa Haus Schoenberg was used as the headquarters of the 85th Brigade. The commander was Brigadier General Douglas MacArthur, a highly decorated World War I soldier who later defeated the Japanese. The dashing MacArthur, rarely seen without a cigarette holder and a riding whip, had a romantic side, according to local historian Richard Volk.
Als MacArthur hier im Dezember 1918 ankam, war eigentlich...
As MacArthur arrived here in December 1918, he was an ill man, having suffered from a gas attack during the war and in need to medical treatment. He wrote in his diary, it was the talent of the brigade doctor and luck that got him through. His luck had a name, Miss Hertha Häuser, the youngest daughter of the villa owner, which nursed MacArthur back to health and whom he fell in love with.
MacArthur's actions were in direct violation of the non-fraternization order, which he often criticized. No one knew about this love relationship until only a few years ago, when some letters to Hertha Häuser suddenly turned up. They had been lost all these years.
Und diese Briefe wurden von amerikanischen Veteranen des Zweiten Weltkrieges.
GIs from the Second World War had discovered these letters and taken them back to the United States, where they laid in a drawer for some 50 years. After the death of these veterans, their families discovered them and gave them to the MacArthur Memorial in Norfolk, Virginia. They determined them to be authentic. I would like to note only two sentences from letters dated in July 1919. For me, The world begins and ends with you. The decisive span of my life has been contained between the day I entered and the day I left Sinzig. In 4 months, MacArthur had fallen in love. He continued to write letters to Hertha, to convince her to come to the United States and join him, but she didn't.
Hertha Häuser later married a Russian baron, Alexander von Perevskin. Paris, June 1919. The peace treaty ending World War I was signed in the Palace of Versailles. It burdened the new German Republic with heavy liabilities. The Americans had wanted a long-lasting peace and a reconciliation of nations. The U.S. Senate would reject the Treaty of Versailles, so that it was not ratified and therefore officially remained in a state of war with Germany. By the summer of 1919, the majority of the 250,000 men once stationed in Germany returned to the United States. General Pershing departed with a parade in Trier. Only the remaining 18,000 doughboys represented the American occupation in Germany. Constant maneuvers and drills were not the only means of preventing boredom among soldiers.
Sports of various kinds, such as basketball, baseball, football, along with track and field, were a primary means of keeping the soldiers busy. The regular competition between men and various units led to championship meets not only within the American zone, but the US Army in general. There were even inter-allied sports competitions between the French, Belgian, British and American forces. These sporting events kept all the soldiers busy.
The Americans constructed the sports fields needed to hold these events.
During the spring of 1919, the Americans held the Rhine Carnival with facilities they had erected. In April 1919, US Third Army held an event in Oberwert. For several days, an impressive program of entertainment and sporting events were held, including track and field. After this event was over, Third Army allowed the sporting facilities to remain standing, and they were used for years. Oberwert is now part of Koblenz, and today a large impressive stadium stands on these grounds.
The Army held horse shows with a Wild West theme in Montabaur, Neuwied, and other locations. Extremely popular among the German population were the military precision drill shows. American jazz music was played in Cochem Castle. Germans learned many new things from the doughboys.
If we let 'em make a feel.
In Koblenz, there was an American donut bakery. Other symbols of American culture, such as Coca-Cola, were soon to follow. One of the first Coke distribution centers was established in Koblenz. Major General Henry T. Allen commanded the U.S. occupation forces from his headquarters in Koblenz. He was noted for his diplomatic talents, a man of compromise, made his feelings known toward the French position as hindering the peace process.
The greatest obsession of France continues to be fear of Germany and the necessity of keeping her eternal enemy weak. Treaties do not make peace.
From the beginning, it was extremely important for the Americans not to be overly strict to the German population, to maintain positive relations and remain on good terms with the local official administration. This was one of the main differences to other occupation forces.
Das ist, glaube ich, ein Wesenszug der amerikanischen Besatzung.
The civilian population was tense and strained, with food in short supply. So the soldiers were not allowed to buy food from the Germans. General Allen wanted to assist the situation, especially for the children. In Koblenz, the Army provided some 2,400 undernourished children with a warm meal. In the entire zone, it was 7,600 children that were provided for by various humanitarian organizations and the U.S. Food Administration. During Christmas in Koblenz, some 500 of the poorest children were given gifts by the doughboys. The average doughboy donated to bring joy to the local children. The gifts included sweets and warm clothing. As a result, the children quickly learned English, a language that only a few German adults understood. Gifts passed out in Litzell, a suburb of Koblenz, where they were badly needed. Otherwise, Allen had refused the French goals because the French tried to infiltrate the American zone. The French wanted total control on the Rhine. Allen rejected these attempts, polite but firm. He also had to keep the German political extremist movements under control. The American and German governments signed a special treaty in August 1921. The Berlin Treaty called for an end of the state of war. The U.S. administration wanted to stabilize Germany as a bulwark against communism. The U.S. Senate decided to withdraw the occupation forces at a time of tense relationship between Germany and France. In January 1923, the last American doughboys departed. In an impressive ceremony at Ehrenbreitstein Fortress, the lowering of the Stars and Stripes was followed by the raising of the French flag. The French troops began arriving thereafter. The local population was fearful of the future. What effects did the American occupation have on Germany?
The Americans would learn that victors have to govern in such a manner that peace be ensured. One can recognize these lessons in the form of one individual in particular. What few will recall, as a young officer, George C. Marshall had served as adjutant to General John J. Pershing in 1919 during the American occupation of Germany. George Marshall would use this knowledge and experience to establish the Marshall Plan for the economic reconstruction of post-World War II Europe. As Secretary of State, he would become famous for these actions, and all of Europe is deeply indebted to this plan. I believe there is a direct relationship between what the Americans learned between 1918 and 1923 and to what occurred after World War II.
In that respect, first American occupation was a success, although hardly anyone recalls it. That is because the longer and more difficult times experienced under the French occupation had overshadowed in German history the American occupation. Johannes and David now know that they are second-degree cousins and are attempting to understand their personal family histories.
It is interesting how the family members back home will react to the different viewpoints of relatives. I believe it is important that this visit explains the past so that new future relationships may develop.
You know, when you realize you got family, it makes you want to stand up for peace and justice and righteousness.
It was the first time that the United States had been directly involved in European affairs. The long-standing German-American relationship began some 100 years ago, here along the Rhine River. As the German Reich Commissioner bid General Allen his farewell, he stated that the Americans had come as enemies, but they depart as friends. Allen answered that this had rarely occurred in history. The short period in which the Americans held the watch on the Rhine is proof that reconciliation is possible.